This is lesson 222, Egyptian civilization. It's called the gift of the Nile. And the reason this is called the gift of the Nile is that's a phrase invented by a Greek visitor to ancient Egypt. I believe it was Herodotus. And he visited Egypt from Greece and he looked around and he said, wow, this place is the gift of the Nile. And basically what he meant by that was the entire reason that Egypt was such a nice place was because of the Nile. And so we've got some things we want to be able to define and know what they are, like a pyramid. Geometry, the importance of geometry in this lesson. We're going to learn a lot about our second river valley civilization, the Nile River Valley. A sun god, what is a sun god? And astronomy, how does astronomy figure into the Egyptians? The Nile River. A pharaoh, what's a pharaoh? What is hieroglyphics? And papyrus. What is papyrus? That's unique to Egypt. Polytheistic, we've seen that before. And monarchy, we've seen that before, but we may not have seen this word here, theocracy. And then finally, something that's also unique to Egyptian culture, mummification. So let's get started. The Nile River. Did you know it's the longest river in the entire world? Not the Amazon, not the mighty Mississippi, it's the Nile. And it begins in the heart of Africa, and then, this is kind of unique, it runs northward into the Mediterranean Sea at the top of that map right there. So, keep this in mind. The Nile flows northward. So on this map, north is actually downriver, and south is actually upriver. The impact of geography. The Nile floods each year, just like the Tigris and the Euphrates did over in Mesopotamia. And then it enriches the soil around it. And this keeps the soil fertile, though not watered. Fertile, yes, but watered, no. So unlike the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers over in Mesopotamia, the Nile is very gentle and very predictable. But you do still need to irrigate. So a large food surplus from Egyptian farmers made Egypt a very prosperous land. Unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt was a politically unified society. Remember, we talked about how Mesopotamia was a hodgepodge of lots of various independent city-states. Well, Egypt is politically unified, and this is because the Nile River was not like the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers over in Mesopotamia. The Nile's gentleness made it easy for boats to navigate. And so the Nile served as the country's central highway, and this enhanced transportation, it enhanced communication, and that made it easy to unify Egypt politically. Egypt's contributions. First of all, Egypt's monarch, Egypt's king, was called the Pharaoh, and he was worshipped as a god. So he was kind of a god king. Egypt had a highly centralized government, like I just mentioned. It was a monarchy, which means that it had one ruler at the top, and it was also a theocracy. And a theocracy means that the religious authorities in the country were also the government. The Pharaoh was a god king, worshipped as a god. Theocracy. Hieroglyphics. Egypt had this writing system called hieroglyphics. It was their writing system. And Egyptian scribes and artists are shown here creating art with hieroglyphics. You see this hieroglyphics right here, and here's kind of a picture of how they were doing it. Notice the grid lines, but these people would create art with hieroglyphics to kind of tell the story. Egypt also had papyrus for writing on. Remember, in Mesopotamia, they had those clay tablets? Well, this papyrus was more like paper, and it was much easier to work with than those Mesopotamian clay tablets. You could roll it up, it was light, you could carry it easily, and so papyrus was definitely an improvement upon those Mesopotamian clay tablets. Mummification. The Egyptians preserved the bodies of the dead for the afterlife, and we'll talk about that later. And here's a process in which they are entombing the mummified pharaoh. Medicine. The Egyptians had more advanced medicine. They could set broken bones and do all kinds of other things. And of course, Egypt had monumental architecture, pyramids, and temples. And keep in mind, a pyramid was not a temple. These structures still survive today, as you can see. Here's a picture of supplying the construction project, building a pyramid right there in the background. Huge, massive operation. So what kind of math do you have to be good at to construct a gigantic, massive pyramid? Well, what do you think? Of course, geometry. And here's some pictures, more pictures of the process of irrigation in Egypt that we can see, and also overseeing. The project is so massive, you have to oversee the project to get a really good view of it from a boat out on the Nile River. Building the pyramids, right? They have a ramp system, just slowly going up and up and up and up until you reach the top, topping off the very top of the pyramid right there. The fertile Nile led to later conquests by people like the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Here's a great picture of some female musicians rehearsing for a performance. And Egyptians liked to party, socialize. Making and decorating a tomb. Notice the grid lines. That's kind of how they would put up those pictures and make sure they're all straight and everything. Oh, I love this. The Colossus of Ramses. Look at the size of this monument. How did they do it? Here's an artist's rendering that shows how the people who did this may have planned it out. Right here like this. That's really cool. Egypt had geographical barriers that invaders had to overcome that protected it from invasion from all sides. It had deserts to the east and to the west, and the Red Sea to the east right there, and it had the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and it also had steep rapids in the southern part of the Nile. The importance of religion. Like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians were also polytheistic. And remember what that means. It means that you believe in more than one God. And their religion gave the Egyptians a sense of security, timelessness, and two groups of gods that they had were the land gods and the sun gods, and the sun gods were especially important. So what kind of science might you want to develop if you want to follow the movements of your sun god? How about astronomy, right? To be able to make a solar calendar? The sun was worshipped as the source of life, and the sun god was named Atum or Re. And the Egyptian ruler, the Pharaoh, was called the son of Re. And so he was the sun god in earthly form. The two important river and land gods were Osiris and Isis. And Osiris had an important role as a symbol of rebirth, whether it was after a physical death or the rebirth of the land when it was flooded by the Nile. Society in ancient Egypt and daily life in ancient Egypt. Egyptian society was organized like a pyramid. The pharaoh was at the top. He was a class of one, and he was surrounded by a ruling class of nobles and priests. Keep in mind that Egypt is not just a monarchy, it's also a theocracy. And these people ran the government, and they managed their extensive land and wealth. So you've got this pyramid right here, and it shows the way the Egyptian society was organized into its various levels. With the pharaoh at the top, he's a class of one, and then government officials, there's where the priests are, there's where the nobles are, soldiers just below that, then scribes, then merchants, then craftsmen, then peasants, and finally slaves. And the reason that the pyramid is widest at the bottom is because there's more slaves and peasants than anyone else. So below the nobles were the professional soldiers, and the next class below that was the merchants and artisans, and below them was a class of peasants, and they usually worked the land that was held by the upper classes. So they rented the land as tenants, and they paid the taxes, and they provided military service, and they did forced labor for the state to build some of these monuments and pyramids. And of course, they were paid for that. They weren't slaves who did that. Marriage and family. Egyptians tended to marry young, and their parents arranged their marriages. Egypt was a patriarchal society, which meant that the men were in charge, and so the husband in the family was the master. But the wife ran the household and educated the children. And some women were merchants, priestesses, and even pharaohs.